And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Saturday, January 25th, 2025. And starting with the sea ice, ice is extensive along the Beaufort Sea coastline down along the Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait. We are seeing some much colder temperatures, sub-zero readings now that are pushing in along the northwest portion of the state down through the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island. We're also going to see increasing northerly winds coming up here in a couple of days. But taking a look at far southern areas here along Kuskokwim Bay, there's been melting, as well as within Bristol Bay. We have an area of low pressure that'll be coming onshore Sunday evening, Sunday night, right across this region, pulling into the southwest interior. So until that feature passes, the really cold air is not going to be able to sweep across the entire southwest. But there is colder air, and this ice will likely start to shift southward again, especially by the time we get into Monday and Tuesday. But looking at the setup, we have a low pressure that'll be crossing the Alaska Peninsula Sunday morning, midday, and then riding up toward the southwest interior, coming on shore there, maybe around Cape Newingham, and then working its way inland along this front. The backside of this low, though, we have blizzard or near blizzard conditions across the Kuskokwim Delta, including Bethel, and then also some heavy snow and near blizzard conditions expected across the eastern Aleutians. Ahead of it, strong southerly moist flow of air, temperatures in the 40s. We have flooding concerns, minor flooding of creeks, rivers, ponding of water in low drainage or poor drainage areas. And then as we get up into the mountains and crossing over the Alaska range, we find that there is at least moderate to heavier snow across areas of the central interior. By the time we get into Sunday afternoon, this low is still working its way across the central Alaska Peninsula, and that front will continue working its way eastward with gusty winds in this atmospheric river, this moist, mild flow of air coming northward, so that by Monday afternoon, the low gets itself up here toward the central middle upper Yukon Valley, with what's left of these fronts as troughs working their way into the Panhandle, as well as down across south central, and then much colder air will be allowed to follow in behind that as we go through the week ahead. Meantime, though, Sunday winds kind of a mix interchannels, northwest 10 knots, Dixon entrance around Metlakatla and Ketchikan. Waves a couple of feet there. Waves 3 to 4 feet, Stevens entrance, especially up there across Lynn Canal with southeast winds to 20 knots. For the outer coast, generally southeast winds 15 knots around and south of Sitka, but as you get further north, those southeast winds turn to easterly gales around Cape Suckling eastward with waves 11 to 15 feet. On Monday, we expect winds to be southeast to south, interchannels 10 to 15 knots, though 35 knots, gust to 40 knots, Lynn Canal, with waves there as high as 5 feet. For the outer coast, south of Sitka, west winds 10 to 15 knots, but look for southwest to west winds around 20 knots from Sitka all the way outside of Yakutat Bay to Cape Suckling with waves of 12 to 14 feet. For Sunday, outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, we have 40-knot southeasterly gales, 35-knot easterly gales within Prince William Sound, waves there 9 feet, but as high as 15, 16 feet there in the north central Gulf, and then also some higher winds upwards of 40 knots here into the lower portion of Cook Inlet with waves there of 13 feet. On Monday, as we have the system lifting northeastward, winds are going to shift more toward the southwest. South winds 25 knots within Prince William Sound, 6-foot waves outside of Hinchinbrook entrance. Southwest winds 30 knots extending off the Kenai coast, 15 to 17-foot waves. And then check out Cook Inlet, some very strong winds. We're looking at southwest gales of 35 to 40 knots, waves running 9 to 13 feet in the open water. Now on Sunday, that low pressure will be crossing the Alaska Peninsula. Ahead of it, southeast to south winds 30-35 knots around Kodiak Island, south 40-knot gales east of Chignik, and then Bristol Bay southeast winds of 30 knots, but whipping around on the backside, northwest gales of 40 knots coming in there at Cold Bay with waves as high as 18 feet. And then for Monday, as the system has lifted into the southwest interior, generally southwest to west winds 30 to 35 knots across Kodiak Island, extending back through the upper portion of the peninsula, and then look for more west-northwest winds around 20 to 25 knots as you trail out there toward Cold Bay and False Pass. The eastern Aleutians on Sunday will still have storm force winds of 45 to 50 knots around Dutch Harbor on Alaska. Again, as we go through this Saturday night, there will be at times near blizzard conditions. Those winds will start to fall off as you get back west of Nikolsky toward Atka, still 35-knot northwest gales. But then as you get west of Adak, winds will be west-northwest, 25 to 30 knots. And for Monday, winds come down across much of the region. We're generally looking at northwesterly winds around 25 knots across the Aleutian chain. And looking at the southwest coast, including the Pribilofs and St. Matthew on Sunday, 30-knot southeasterly winds here in Bristol Bay. North winds to 45 knots. That's why there's this blizzard warning for Bethel down along the Kuskokwim Delta, because the strong north winds on the backside of this low in front is what's driving the wind and heavy snow. Same thing out toward the Pribilofs, north gales of 35 knots extending up to St. Matthew, where waves could be as high as 14 feet there through the Pribilofs. And then in areas of Norton Sound down along the lower Yukon coast through Etolan Strait, north side of Nunavik Island, north gales to 35 knots. For Monday, we find that the cold air will begin to finally pull further south. The ice will tend to also want to drift southward as well. West winds within Bristol Bay, 30 knots, northwest 30-knot winds within Kuskokwim Bay, and then along the coast, the lower Yukon Delta there, northwest winds to 30 knots, northwest winds 25 knots as we get off toward St. Matthew and St. Paul. And then through the Bering Strait Sunday, we have some very cold, bitter cold air well below zero here over eastern Russia, pushing into the northwest portion of the state, western Seward Peninsula. We're looking at northerly winds of 30 knots through the Bering Strait and along the north side of St. Lawrence Island. As we go up along the Chukchi Sea coastline, winds turn back more westerly and pick up 25 to 30 knots along the Beaufort Sea coast, especially from Utqiagvik on over to Kaktovik. And then by Monday, the winds strengthen out over the lower Chukchi Sea and Bering Strait. We are anticipating northerly gales of 35 to 40 knots extending all the way down to the north side of St. Lawrence Island. So there'll be blowing snow. There'll be some shifting ice with that kind of wind. That cold air will be allowed to head further south and eastward into the mainland. And along the Beaufort Sea coast for Monday, we are anticipating northeast winds, Prudhoe Bay to Utqiagvik, 10 to 15 knots, but westerly winds around 20 knots there at Kaktovik.